Welcome to the afternoon session. After this plenary, which I hope you attended, there's not much more to say about the need to plant trees. And this session now follows up on this in a bit different spirit. It's about REDD+, which is not something you can spell backwards. You can, but it doesn't make sense. So we are trying to make sense of REDD in this session. And actually, the session is a continuum, so to say, with a small session right afterwards, which you find in the program, which is a book launch. We have just finished a new book in C4 on REDD+. It's called Transforming REDD, Lessons and New Directions, which we are then launching right afterwards. So this discussion forum now for the next 90 minutes is going to be about REDD analysis. It draws heavily on that book, but it also gets us some voices from people from the practice, from the reality, who are on the panel, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute. My name is Christopher Matthews. I'm team leader for climate change in C4, and so this is a session we have been organizing jointly between C4 and FTA, the collaborative program, research program on forestry and agroforestry, and it draws heavily on this book, as I said, but we are not only talking about the book. So the book launch will be right afterwards. And so on the panel, we have two speakers first who are actually the part of the editorial team of this book. One is Arild Engelsen. He's professor in the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and he's also senior associate with C4. He's been working at C4 for a few years, for many years actually, before he went back to Norway. And I'm going to give his vita in a minute. Then we have Anne Larsen, who is my colleague, also a team leader for equal opportunities, gender, justice, and tenure at C4. Then we have Gita Siarani. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping the line. You're sitting different, but so we have Gita here on the end of the seating arrangement. She's head of Secretariat in the Sustainable Districts Platform and Executive Director to the Secretariat of Sustainable District Association in Indonesia. And finally, we have Nathan Makuregie, who is an Ugandan human and environmental activist engaged in promoting, defending, and protecting the rights of indigenous people in Uganda. So this is our panel, and we're going to listen to their presentations, and then we're going to have a question and answer session in which you then can put up your questions. We're going to have a microphone that's going to be brought to you if you raise your arm. So we want to jump right into the section now. So Arild will start speaking. As I said, he's a professor in the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. He has 20 years of research into the cause of tropical deforestation and its interaction with poverty, tenure, and government policies. He has also worked a lot on REDD+, how reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation can be included in a global climate regime. And he has also been coordinating the the Poverty Environment Network, PEN, a C4-led research program that collected detailed information from forest households, about 8,000 households in 24 developing countries. So part of this huge database was also used to find answers about REDD+. And so I'm going to give the floor to Arild. We're going to look deeply at REDD+ in this session, trying to understand where it is. We called this book Transforming REDD, because we thought that REDD was originally intended as a transformative action, and certainly that hasn't happened as fast and as quick and as cheap as planned. But still, you just heard how important it is to grow trees, to plant trees, and so we should be watching closely in one of the largest international experiments, so to say, in a very complex regime of getting forests back into the ground. And the other part of transforming REDD means also how can REDD be transformed to be more effective and efficient in the future. It's been a day of several birthdays have been mentioned today. For 25 years, GLF, the Global Landscapes, from 5 years. So REDD Plus has 10 years, somewhere in the middle, and we are going to look at it. And I stop talking now and give the floor to Aaron. Please.
Thank you. So, we are launching this book, and it's about as exciting as getting a child to have finished a book. I hope the presentation will appear soon. We start the book by saying that by the World Cup in 2022, which is to be held in Qatar, we will have spent the carbon budget for staying within 1.5 degrees. That is, we can continue our emissions as we do today, and then stop everything in 4 years. Then we will have reached it. I mean, the probability of that happening is about the same as Norway winning the World Cup. But it just shows some of the urgency when we heard in the plenary that we need to stay between 1.5. The challenge is enormous. One of the solutions to meet that challenge has, of course, been REDD, that has been around. And when we are launching this book today, as the fourth in a series of books that, well, there have been more books, but at least in this format, an edited volume where we take stock of what's happening and try to look ahead in all the 4 books. We are building on 10 years of research in the Global Comparative Study on REDD, different partners, and quite impressive amount, about 500 scientific publications that I'm trying to summarize in 20 minutes. We also, in the previous book, we looked at we have phases of REDD, and we also phases of REDD research. And one of the first phase is designing REDD and learning from their related experience in the past. That was the first 2 books. You see they have been published in different languages as well. And the second, Analyzing REDD in 2012, was more about the political economy and the implementation issues. What are the troubles? And then the third phase, also mirroring the paying for results phase of REDD, is really to assess the impacts. What have we achieved? And this book is touching on all the 3, because the very first issues on the design and learning from related experience are still very much with us, and of course also the implementation and the political economy of implementing REDD. Our approach has been to be what we call constructive critique of the REDD, and some even have labeled us in the writing that this has been a CFOR approach, being critical but at the same time fans of REDD. To provide some critical evidence-based analysis of REDD implementation without losing sight of the urgent need to reduce forest-based emissions to prevent a potentially catastrophic climate change. Now, in doing this, as Chris alluded to also, it is critical to distinguish between REDD, the objective, and REDD as a framework or as an umbrella term for all the actions that aims to reduce forest-based emissions. Now, so if some ask me, are you for or against REDD? What do you think of REDD? And I say, I'm a big fan of REDD as an objective. And then the activities, the approaches that we choose, that's of course going to be debate. Some take it, and there are different terms, some take it to be the broad umbrella term. Some say, well, it's that part of those projects that have a clearly result-based component. And others, if you go to COP, and some may define REDD is what is defined within the UNFCCC framework. When we chose the title. It was this double meaning, transforming REDD to be transformational. And we point to three things that have changed over the last 5-6 years. Of course, we got the Paris Agreement 3 years ago with a new global architecture, a bottom-up that in some cases we like to think of as a good approach, but it means that countries submit their pledges or the nationally determined contributions in the form of the NDCs, and that takes the center stage. Domestic and aid funding is probably likely to dominate rather than the initial idea of REDD funding through carbon markets. A changing global political climate, we struggle a bit with the formulations for this, but you have climate deniers in high offices, and they, you know the names, they shall not be said, but that is having an impact on it. And I think also those who are not climate deniers but kind of say and speak about climate change and the need for action but can hide between the climate deniers is also kind of slowing down the process. So while we have the IPCC 1.5 degree report and the climate deniers, this gap between the climate reality and the political will is kind of widening. We also have the evolving REDD that we have learned quite a few things over the past. And with high expectations, we also have to do some expectation management to avoid disappointments and fatigue and be realistic of what to expect. We have divided the book into 4 parts, and I will go quite quickly through the chapters and then highlight some of the overall findings, and Anne will talk about one of them. But the first part on the building blocks, including finance, that we have some on national politics and the coordination problems. We have one section on assessing impacts and one on evolving initiatives for initiatives that are reviewed. I just wonder, are you able to read the one on the, if not, you have to buy new glasses. So you can half read it, but I'm not going through that. But let's start on very quickly on a few of the chapters that are in the book, 16 in total. The first, the theory of change, led by Christoph, is trying to take into account, if REDD has a theory of change, what is it? When I first come across this theory of change concept, it was in some project application. I thought it was an annoying requirement from donors to spell out how do you think you're going to have an impact. But actually, it's quite useful. We want to do research, we want to do projects for a change, so we better spell out how we think about it. And REDD had a theory, not very articulated, but it also has a number of theories of change. And I think when you hear the debate about it, it's part about REDD and project and successes and failures, partly reflecting quite different theories of change. We have listed a few here. The economic incentives that was key to REDD, the institutional change and coordination, that you need to change the institution, the laws and regulations. You have the empowerment, power to the people, and all you need is rights, if you want to put it in a slogan format. We have the information that many of us researchers a bit naively think will change the world, and a more planning approach. Chapter 3 looks into the financing of REDD and trying to take stock of this. It has been a major change. A couple of key messages from this chapter is that, first, it's a very small number of donors, Germany, Norway, a few others, that are heavily involved and support it. Readiness funding is kind of drying out, so the latecomers have less access to that than the front runners have had in the past. Countries are increasingly relying on their own funding to do that, and a lot of costs, particularly if you start talking about the opportunity cost, the foregone benefits of forest conservation, they are mainly borne by the countries themselves. Private sector finance, it's also a separate chapter on that we thought would be forthcoming after the New York Declaration in 2014, has not been, although we also lack data of that to really assess the contribution. Result-based payment was a key element in the theory of change. you pay countries for reducing emission. It's a strong incentive. Thinking like an economist, you need economic incentives. You're rewarded for doing the right thing for the global environment. And it's also kind of a fairness argument. Those who carry the cost of reducing emissions, it's fair that we should compensate. So it's both an efficiency and kind of an equity argument in that. We look in this chapter some of the challenges, very basic ones. What to pay for, how to set the reference level, so a benchmark to measure the success, who should be paid, who have the carbon rights, and the potential of biases, because how you define, for example, a reference level or how you define the recipients of result-based payment has strong political elements and strong kind of determine who is receiving the benefits. We'll look into that and try to find some solutions. Information-driven change, led by Nikki, sitting probably there. DC from Wageningen. The key idea of information, better information leads to better policies, right? That's kind of the hypothesis. But information is something that is produced and it can be manipulated in subtle ways, or it can be kind of chosen. You have a number of numbers to pick from, and you can choose them. So information is also modified through processes where those with power, those with vested interest, may determine what information is produced and how it's used. National politics, and we'll talk at least about 2 of the chapters, but Tui led a chapter on national NDCs and policy integration. A lot of countries have included, more than 50 do mention NDCs, mention REDD in their NDCs and the role it has in forest mitigation. What is needed is to take this and really translate it into policies and actions on the ground. Very few address the drivers that has been discussed, I think, at least since 2011 in the UNFCCC, but that is not much dealt with within the NDC. So they have started, but there are a few more steps to be taken. I skip this because Anne is talking about, at least she's a co-author of both these 2 chapters. Assessing impacts. Jan Berner, a professor at Bonn University, has reviewed the evidence on does national forest policies, do they reduce forest loss? And the answer, I was kind of positively surprised, I have to say, as an editor of this book, that there's a few studies that show, yes, there is a positive impact, but not as large as kind of we would expect from theory. But on average, it's a positive, but a low impact. There's no particular kind of silver bullet or kind of that you can pick a policy winner. It's too few studies to kind of declare a winner of this. And it points that while REDD was supposed to be about policy reforms, we really lack studies, particularly from Africa, to seriously assess the impact of policies. Moving down to the subnational initiatives, Gabriella led a chapter on taking stock of what has been the impact of the subnational initiatives on forest and forest carbon stocks. Again, very few studies for various reasons, financial, it costs something, methodological. It's not simple to do this, to do an impact assessment, because you have to have data for control areas to establish the counterfactual, which is the key in any impact assessment. What would have happened without REDD? And that's a hypothetical thing to set. And also political challenges of implementing rigorous. The outcome is kind of a bit similar like on the national level, that on average we can report a modestly positive effect of this, that on average they seem to do okay, but not dramatic impacts. There are other forces at play. We looked at, or they looked at, different types of policies, the disincentives, where you have the more regulatory approach, like a protected areas and land use zoning, that were quite effective, but as we saw later or in the next chapter, this also involves a trade-off with well-being outcomes. So modestly encouraging is the tweetable summary of this. Well-being impacts led by Amy Duchel, also sitting over there. Small and somewhat more mixed effects, but that these effects are clearly more positive for well-being when you have incentives involved. Incentive in the meaning of some monetary payment or compensation to the communities or to the households. And that results are more likely to be equitable and long-lasting if local people are genuinely involved in the work. You tell when 5 minutes left. Part 4, evolving initiatives. One of the major ones that has emerged over the last, I don't know how many years, 5, 6, 7 years, is the subnational and jurisdictional approaches, partly from the governor's initiative, and the governor, the first at least being Arnold Schwarzenegger in California. I think the staggering figure from this chapter is that 28% of the world's tropical forests are covered by these 39 jurisdictional initiatives that is reviewed. 28%. So when you're talking that projects are too small, well, this is actually covering getting up to a third of the tropical forest areas. And most of these, 38 out of 39, they've also taken concrete actions and made formal commitments to reducing deforestation. Well, it's an extensive review together with Earth Innovation Institute, and CIFOR in the report, but this summarizes that report and lists a number of these actions that have been taken. Now you can ask, has this also given some measurable results on the ground? Annual deforestation decreased for the last 5 years in about half of them, but to really link that and attribute it to the actions, it's hard. So it's still an early and still too early to kind of tell what the impact has been. Private sector pledges, another one I mentioned, and Pablo Pacheco and a few co-authors review the experience of that, and for 5 key commodities. Again, it's very hard to, there's a number of nice pledges and different forms of commitments that have been made, but to really assess the impact. And I have to say, if there is some private here, to be more transparency and openness about it, so we are able to, as researchers, to assess impacts is really key. Another that has been done already, but should continue, is to link this more closely to the jurisdictional approaches. Climate smart agriculture, another evolving initiative, not directly related to REDD, but could contribute, and where we, because I'm a co-author of this chapter, look at an old question that I also asked when I started at CIFOR 20 years ago. What is the impact of higher yields on forests? In one way, it can reduce the area, as some claim that the Green Revolution have done, and we have some very interesting figure in that chapter on the impact of the Green Revolution we should look at. But the problem with higher yield is also increase the profitability, so if farmers have the possibility to sell more whatever they produce in a larger market, they may also take that opportunity and buy a chainsaw to expand their land. So to have the land-sparing outcomes, you need to have supplementary forest conservation measures. That is the key message. Last chapter, 3, forest restoration, which is kind of the plus part of REDD that has really come into force, where you want to increase the foreign carbon stock, which is the last part of the Bali REDD definition. A review of some 150 projects in Latin America and how they have started. Promising initiatives. Main point I learned, very few of these are tracking carbon. So how are we going to measure success if they are not have a system in place for doing that? Is it just some demonstrations, some show-off projects, or do we really, can we say in 5 years' time this worked or not? The system to answer that question has not been put in place. Summarizing REDD. The first part, finance and building blocks, we have some progress compared to 10 years ago, unquestionable. a few intermediate outputs and outcomes. REDD has gained prominence. I mentioned some of these national initiatives that are put in place. The action part still not yet there. In terms of the impacts, mixed and moderately positive, summarizing that. I think a very important story that we are going to agree on in the next few years is to explain the modest outcomes. Now, the first thing is, of course, to say that we had too high expectations, and optimism bias is one of the human flaws. We tend to overestimate the probability of positive outcomes and underestimate. And sometimes that's okay, because we embark on new and exciting things. We use a medical metaphor to try to explain. And the first argument is that REDD has been the wrong medicine. And it comes in different versions, as you can see here. The second is that the dosage is too small. REDD has not really been tested as we planned, which is true. Would it have worked much better? Perhaps. But it's also the risk that if you have thrown big money in a systems that were not ready to receive them, we would also maybe be standing here and talking about corruption and highly efficient use of $10 billion per year or something. The disease has progressed too far, which is kind of saying that the problems of deforestation is deep structural causes. It has to do with political interests, economic interests that benefit from converting forests to palm oil or pastures or whatever crop that is more profitable. And these are embedded in political system. And if that's true, whatever kind of cure you tried would not have worked any better. The more optimistic view is, of course, to say that recovery will come eventually, be patient, and then you will see improvements. Of course, we cannot test this, and we can try to tell stories. What I hope with the book is that we are not starting to kind of try to invent a new miracle cure based on this, but that we are trying to address some very deep and hard problems, and REDD was an honest attempt, and we have learned a few things. How can we make REDD more effective? Just a few headlines, and you can read all of this in the concluding chapter that is available online or in the book, the hard copy. I think I'll just point to one here. Nurturing optimism by stressing the positive side effects of REDD. And that is to build a positive, exciting narrative on forests. In the PEN project that Christoph mentioned that I was part of, we found that about 1/5, 22% of the household income among 8,000 households living in forest-rich locations across 24 countries were from forests. And that's a substantial part. A more recent is the biopump, or aerial rivers, where forests transport rain from the oceans into the interior, and that most of the rainfall, for example, in the Amazon is not from the oceans, but it's from evaporation from trees. And this role that it plays that is needed to avoid that being a desert. So these are, I think, exciting new findings that can help to build this positive narrative. We end this with kind of comparing REDD to a teenager, because it came on the agenda in 2005 at the COP in Montreal in Canada. So REDD is just 13 years old. So if you have a teenager, and I've had 3, trying to raise them, what can unfold? So one is the mature one. REDD matures and becomes like we thought, like the parents thought. Result-based payment, national policies are integrated, local national synergies on tenure, blah, blah. The big issues are gradually solved. Dream scenario. The other one is that REDD, at least as result-based payment or PES, it fades away. It goes into the history on the list of conservation fads. Maybe also the REDD objective will lose ground, a new fatigue, and we find another buzzword and another silver bullet that we can believe and get engaged in. Not me, but the next generation. A more kind of intermediate outcome is that REDD objective survives, and it should, but a new acronym and maybe a revised approach with a broader toolbox will emerge. And we conclude by saying what the toolbox and the measures we're using should be subject to scrutiny and constantly revised. And ideologies, interests, past positions to defend success that we have been involved in, that should not bias that acceptance. We should be very honest about what works and what not, because we cannot afford not to work. The name is secondary and it's substitutable, but that we keep the objective of doing REDD as a way to avoid, REDD the objective to avoid catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel, for this tour de force over 300 pages of results. We got funding for this research, which is actually the Global Comparative Study on REDD+, going on for the last 10 years. And one of the leaders of this program is sitting in the room, Lou Verschow, who was heading this program before I did. So I'd like to recognize that you're here. And thanks for being here. And the funding we are currently getting for this research is coming from NORAD, from Norway, and the other part of the funding comes from the German BMU under the EKI program, the International Climate Initiative. And one of the programs they were funding, particularly in our comparative study, was a look at multi-level governance of REDD+. We thought it was really interesting to look into how national and subnational local activities relate to each other in this, and so EKI found that interesting, and they funded this program, and it's coming to an end. It was led by, or is being led by Anne Larsen, who is now going to give us a little bit of a summary of that program. So Anne, I'm going to tell you who Anne is. Besides being a team leader for, as I said before, for equal opportunities, gender, justice, and tenure, which is a huge program, I would say. She has degrees from Stanford and Berkeley. She does research on forest and landscape governance, policy and institutions, including property rights, tenure, climate change, decentralization, indigenous territories, and gender. And she does that from local to international scales. She's also a member of the Council of the International Association for the Study of the Commons, and she represents CIFO in the Rights and Resources Initiative. So Anne, I would like to ask you to come forward here and tell us a little bit about multi-level questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Pull up the presentation. Do I get a presentation? Yes, okay. So I'm going to talk about multi-level governance and coordination challenges in land use negotiations. So one of the common themes in all of this is who's talking to whom, how are we solving problems, and this issue of coordination across levels, across sectors is a key one to REDD and anything else that comes after it. So I'll talk a little bit about the multi-level governance research itself. Then I'm going to talk about decentralization, if you all remember this topic of decentralization, and come a little bit back to this kind of history question. And in that, I'm going to mention a little bit about the subnational governments and jurisdictional initiatives. And finally, a few conclusions about this challenge of coordination. So when we talk about multi-level governance, we took this on not as just a national, international to local kind of level of relationships, but also the horizontal relationships. So it's really about multi-level, multi-sectoral, multi-actor relationships that we decided to look at. And as you know, basically, if you look at a plot of land, there are many different actors who have an influence on what actually is going to happen on any particular plot of land. So our research questions around multi-level governance were across levels and sectors, how and why are land use decisions being made? Are investments or interventions in reducing carbon emissions, such as REDD projects, actually leading to any changes in land use decisions or any changes on the ground? And if not, why not? and what are the challenges to and opportunities for really bringing about transformational change. So what we decided to do was look at how are land use decisions happening now, and then how is REDD kind of coming into this arena. So these are the countries we worked in. I'm actually putting here phase 2. This is part of the Global Comparative Study on REDD. I joined that in phase 2, and we looked at this particular question around multi-level governance in Peru, Indonesia, Vietnam, Tanzania, and Mexico. And currently, we're working in a new phase with phase 3 in 4 countries, Peru, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and Brazil, where we're looking a little bit more closely at this question of coordination around multi-stakeholder initiatives. That's being led by my colleague, Juan Pablo, who's also here today. So in the multi-level governance study, like I said, we kind of looked at these, how decisions are happening on the ground now. So we worked in these 5 countries. Within each country, we chose 2 to 3 subnational regions, which are jurisdictions, either states or provinces. And within those, we looked for 5 places of land use change where something was happening. 2 of the sites were sites of ongoing deforestation and degradation, and 3 of the sites where there was something else happening trying to change those trajectories. We called them kind of increasing and decreasing emission sites, but we didn't measure emissions, so that's not technically accurate. So some of them were REDD sites, and some of them were other efforts like conservation initiatives, pest initiatives, to try to change the trajectories of land use. So what are some of our findings? First of all, coordination problems across levels and sectors include all sorts of things we're aware of: barriers to information sharing, lack of clear responsibilities, lack of sound channels of communication, the failure to integrate local needs. We also found forum shopping among actors responsible for deforestation. Actually, we kind of find forum shopping among all different actors. So forum shopping is when there are different people who actually have authority over an area. You can go to one, and if you don't get what you want, you can try another one instead and see if that way works. And when you're talking about multi-level governance and different levels of authority among layers of government, it's really easy to go to the central government. You don't go what you need, go down to the province. The province doesn't work, try the district. Sometimes this is all very legal, and of course, sometimes there are other forces at work in terms of getting what you want. And the other thing that we found was that those who deforest actually seem to be much better at coordinating among themselves than those seeking low emissions alternatives. So when we talk about coordination, we have to remember who's coordinating with whom here, and what exactly are we talking about. For subnational governments, decentralization policies and nested REDD initiatives provided new opportunities for innovation, but they also faced barriers to the national government's centralizing tendencies and limited budgets and capacities. And we also found that there were fundamental problems with these top-down approaches that solely focused on the technical to avoid politics. And by technical here, I don't just mean focusing on MRV systems or something scientifically technical, but using technical in the terminology of social scientists like Tanya Lee around rendering technical, simplify, make everything simpler. We want to come in with a blueprint rather than and having to engage with the complexity at the local level. So I'm going to come back to this topic of decentralization. Remember decentralization? Is anybody here old enough to know that there was 20 years of work on decentralization before we ever got into this idea of multi-level governance? So from the 1990s and 2000s, there was a lot of decentralization debates. C4 actually had a section, one of our themes was decentralization. Forestry decentralization played a big role in the whole debates around decentralization in general. Decentralization was part of the recipe of good governance, very much supported by the World Bank and others. It was considered to be sort of a simple, again, kind of technical step in progress towards greater democracy. It was seen to be a better tool to be more efficient. Local leaders were much more likely to be aware of the problems in their communities, and therefore would direct actions more efficiently at what actually needed to be done. Improve government performance, deepen democracy by increasing accountability. You're closer to your citizens, so you can be held accountable more easily. Of course, these were great ideals in some ways, better than good intentions, more than actual real implementation in practice. But decentralization has continued, and it's actually quite strong in many countries. So there's a lot of decentralizing while centralizing, a lot of flipping back and forth in terms of where power actually lies. But there is a lot to draw on from this history of decentralization. And 10 years later, when REDD came on the scene, there were some fears that REDD would actually foment forestry re-centralization. So in our research in the 5 countries on multi-level governance, we have a database of over 700 interviews with people mostly at subnational level around, again, these 54 actual total sites of land use change, from private sector to government at various levels, civil society, communities, federations, and NGOs. And based on those interviews, we just asked people, we went through our entire database and looked at the mention of who people perceived had the authority on land use decisions, the ones that were really affecting use on the ground. This is perception only. And you can see here, I'd say that we definitely see some real serious decentralization, at least in the way people perceive how land use, who affects land use and land use decisions and land use change. The first level of subnational government in our interviews definitely appears to have the greatest powers. That's not necessarily true in terms of law. Central government also, by law, clearly holds greater powers in some ways. So coming to what subnational governments have been able to do, though, Harold already mentioned a little bit of this. He skipped a chapter I wasn't going to present, and he did present a chapter. I am, but anyway, poor coordination. Speaking of coordination. So, as he mentioned, 28% of the world's remaining tropical forest is located in these 39 subnational political geographies that have committed to jurisdictional sustainability agendas. Nearly half of these have seen declining deforestation rates in the last half decade, though again, we can't necessarily prove at this point that that's linked to the policies they've undertaken recently. So this is the map of those 39 jurisdictions. 35 of them are members of the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, which has been bringing together these subnational jurisdictions in a global initiative around jurisdictional sustainability. And these are some of the commitments that they've made. What you'll see here is, so there's commitments they've made to reduce deforestation, reduce emissions, reforestation and restoration through the Bond Challenge. There's sustainable agricultural targets and there's socioeconomic targets, and even more recently, there's also a commitment to respecting the rights of indigenous peoples in these jurisdictions, which is also extremely important. The solid green bar is the best. There are both commitments and there's performance targets. Some of the others you'll see have a commitment but not a performance target, or a performance target but without any particular formal commitment, but that's partly because there isn't one around sustainable agriculture. The GCF has not created a specific commitment around that. So there's a lot going on in terms of what they're committing to at least trying to do, and in some cases really measure performance on. So from our research on multi-level governance, these are preliminary findings because we're still mining the database a bit. REDD has not created this predicted possible re-centralization, at least overall, that is not the case. However, the central government really does have the most legal authority over what happens on the ground. When powers are decentralized, it's that directly lower entity of government that gets most of the powers and authority, or it's favored in many ways, while all of the other lower levels complain a lot that they aren't getting anything. So there's kind of a re-centralization at this first subnational level. There's also a lot of partial decentralization, especially giving authority or powers without any resources to actually carry out those mandates. And it limits the subnational capacity to implement and be accountable. There's also confusion over roles and responsibilities, allows a little bit of that forum shopping that I was talking about earlier. Forests remain an important source of state funds often, and conflict, which also has to do a bit with the centralizing tendencies. And corruption, of course, remains a structural barrier at all levels of government. So wrapping up now with a few conclusions. Why is change so difficult? Subnational governments are clearly making some serious efforts here to bring about change, but there are problems in terms of the actual powers and authority they have, as well as capacities, funding. A lot of what the GCF has found in the research they've done on this is that the governments have been putting in their own money and really taking the burden of a lot of the funding of this, of these alternatives. Coordination. The biggest problem we heard in all of our research, I think if we looked for a word search in our 750 interviews, it would be the word that appears most common, is the problem with coordination. Multi-level, multi-sectoral, and multi-actor. And what we see coming out of all of this is these calls for integrated landscape approaches, multi-sectoral initiatives, multi-stakeholder platforms, all sorts of New ideas? Maybe. So this is my question. Are we learning from these past initiatives? Is multi-level governance something we talk about because we learned from decentralization and decided that this is something new and different? Or are we just creating a new term that doesn't really build on what we should know and should have learned and the lessons that we should take away from those experiences, all those years of studying decentralization? And the same with participation. These integrated landscape initiatives, multi-stakeholder processes, the multi-stakeholder forums that we're studying now, is this a new idea that's building on the understanding of all of the research on participation that we've done? Or is it just another catchword to call it something different and fail to learn from the past lessons that we have? And I fear that we haven't learned enough from our past lessons. So in the chapter on coordination in the book, one of the things we argue is that some coordination problems can't be solved through greater coordination. It's important to distinguish between coordination failures in REDD policy, or land use policy in general, and implementation that can be addressed through improved coordination, and those that arise from fundamental differences in goals and interests. Not all solutions can be negotiated, such as when highly unequal power relations combine with entrenched differences of interest. So coordination isn't only about who's at the table, but it's also about which game are we playing. And I think a lot of times we come to this playing field, or whatever it is, thinking that we're all putting a puzzle together, and that we all have equal power and are bringing the different puzzle pieces together, and we just have to get the arrangement right. But other people are playing poker, and some of them have cards up their sleeve, and deals going on under the table or away from the actual playing table itself. So I think these are really important issues to keep in mind as we go forward and look for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, whether that's REDD as the current formulation or REDD as a goal in whatever particular new kind of initiative we bring forward in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Before we proceed, I actually wanted to invite those people standing in the back. There's a whole empty table here. It had some reserved signs on it before, but they were taken away, so you can comfortably sit there. Please come forward. Okay, great. Let me check the time. So you have heard a few things from academicians, researchers of REDD+, and of forest governance and forest economics and so on. But we also think we need a reality check, and maybe the reality check can come from those people that are looking at REDD from the ground. And so one of those people we are asking to provide us with the feedback on this is Gita Siarani. She's a Executive Director for the Secretariat of Sustainable District Association in Indonesia. It's a membership-based association managed and established and managed by district leaders in Indonesia since 2017, trying to use a collective approach to accelerate and better support their district sustainable development vision. Gita was also a senior program manager in the Indonesian Palm Oil Pledge, IPOP. And she was a leading member in the planning and funding deputy of the former National REDD Agency, you know, the Indonesian REDD Agency under the presidency that was extinct 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. Gita also had a senior associate position and was a lead counsel for the Green Investment and Climate Change Division, in which she set up independent corporate law firms in Indonesia. And then she also served as a member of the Permanent Committee of International Affairs at the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And finally, she has a lot of other things, but I also wanted to mention one where she works with communities, and particularly with something called Indonesia Plastic Bag Diet, a waste management movement. I think it's another scourge, the plastic on this planet, particularly getting into the food chain and into the oceans. So that's a great CV you have amassed. You should be 80 years old. So we hope. Maybe you come forward and give us your thoughts on REDD+.
10 minutes, is it? Yes. I'm going to time. I don't know if the slide is loaded, but hi, everyone. My name is Gita. As Christopher kindly invited me just a few days ago to join the panel, the expectation is actually to have something that is commenting on the new book. That's congratulations. I know it must be really hard. So it was my in-flight reading for the entire night, last night. And luckily, there's a specific chapter that talks about my work right now with the Sustainable District Association. It's a very recent initiative that was started from 2 districts, one in in West Kalimantan called Sintang, and another one in Musi Banyu Asin in South Sumatra. But one thing that's quite different, actually, in comparison to what REDD+ was offering and what the GCF was offering also, the membership that LTKL, we call it in Indonesia, offers is not limited to only heavy forested area. So it portrays some sort of a mini Indonesia where you have the extreme left, something like 78% forest cover, and you have the extreme right that are almost no forest left, but are so burdened with conflict that even though they want to do something better, they don't have the resources or the time to do so. And in Indonesia, there has been a lot of talk about incentivizing the need to keep our forest standing. And in a way, when this is being heard by the public finance side, the argument has always been, so what about the rest, the ones that are not protecting the forest? Could you give me an argument in which I issue a policy to enable those that are protecting the forest to have more resources and not get yelled at by the other ones? That are what we're trying to put in place right now. So something for everyone. What the district association represent are, this is just for figure of speech. We're not building this. But this is the way that district government, in fact, what Anne just presented, has a lot to do with this picture. So imagine in a district where when you talk about sustainability or green vision, the only ear that would sort of prick up is only the planning agency or only the environmental agency. Those are the 2. And in each district in Indonesia, and we have 514 in total, and we have a national association that is an umbrella for that. LTKL is under that. We have at least 28 to 35 different agencies that needs to collaborate. So when you have only 2 out of 35, then you see a problem that looks like this picture. This is just a graph. There's no, and sorry, this is converted from a MacBook. That's why all of the graphics are, yeah. But I always use this slide as a comparison to where we are now, because the main problem with this coordination is actually the level of trust. So whenever I speak to my parents even, like I work with district government, number one thing that they would say is, are you sure? Are you sure they're reliable? Are you sure? Like, why are you helping them? Aren't they corrupt? These are the typical responses that I got. But similarly, when it comes to local CSO on the ground, for example, when I said, why don't you talk to this company because they have this type of best management practice, the typical response is also, but we have such a bad history with companies. They often chase the orang rimba. They often close up the gate from us to take the resources. Why would we want to collaborate with them? This is what this slide is trying to show is actually we are at that level, the red circle, so it's a minus. It's not even a 0. So this is where we're starting from. And this is, okay, this is not forest fire. This is bonfire. And this is the concept that we take for LTKL, Sustainable District Association. The word in Indonesia, lingkar temu, means the circle to meet. which is derived from this original concept that Indonesians are typically used for decision making, which is a bonfire. And this is what we want to get to someday. And just as a historical reference, again, it was established in 2016 where two district government feels that they've been imposed to a lot of this concept called jurisdictional approach, verified sourcing area, jurisdictional certification, things that they somehow don't connect to, although it's being put in their territory. So I came as a facilitator at that time where they said, can you please find other jurisdictions that might be interested in this idea? We will give them a meeting room, but nothing else. So from there, we invited 15 and 8 came. And what came from the December meeting in 2016 is an agreement to make a forum that is fully led by the district government. Of course, this is not an example, a good example that I'm standing here on behalf of the jurisdiction because everybody is busy in Poland, but yeah. It's fully led by the district government, meaning that all of the decision-making power lies with the General Assembly, and we as the Secretariat are an operating arm. And this was solidified through their declaration in 2017, July, where they actually came up and made these 3 declarations. 1 is Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2 is emission reduction through the NDC. And number 3 is open government. Why this 3? Because all 3 have national action plan in Indonesia. And it comes with a set of, unfortunately, additional obligation. We've went through and shift through all of the national action plan, and it resulted to 567 different indicators that district government have to fulfill and report. So, what next? We have a membership-based association that the founder want to cap to maximum 10. Why? Because they want to work with serious ones. So we as the Secretariat has the mandate every year to recommend to them which ones are being struck out. And because there's no performance yet, because at this point in time it's just political commitment, what we can actually help them with is administrative challenges. But with administrative challenges, we can already insert some of the basic principles of the 3 things that they declare. For example, number 1 requirement when you want to enter LTKL is you have to submit 5 basic documents. 1 is your special plan, and it has to come with your environmental impact assessment. Number 2 is your midterm development plan. Number 3 is your budget, midterm budget plan. Number 4 is an environmental status report that you submit every year to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And number 5 is your performance review. You submit also every year to the Home Affairs Ministry to allow them to allocate your budget. Those are all public documents. But if I ask maybe Amy or Anne or people that have researched this for a while, you don't download it easily. In fact, when we ask them to give us those documents, 6 out of 8 submitted, 4 out of 6 bring us hard copy. So literally, 8 boxes they bring to the office because they still don't believe that technology is something that's safe. These are our theory, because unlike the outstanding speakers here, I was a corporate lawyer, so I'm not a researcher. So I've tried to use theory to back up whatever it is that we're trying to help the district with. And these are a recent theory. It's called collective impact. It was developed by a group of donors, actually, that wanted to understand how they can make better impact out of the resource allocation. And it highlights 6 components: common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, backbone support, and number 6, we proudly add ourselves, champion leaders. And it doesn't always have to be the Bupati, the district head. We've seen through this year, working with them, that champions can actually be the 2nd or the 3rd layer that are more stable, that are there not because political appointment, but because they earn the position. I will give you the much neater slide, sorry. So we work backwards, coming from those 5 elements. How can we help them first define the common agenda? Because SDGs, open government, and emission reduction is very huge. So we asked them to pick 5 priority sectors. Well, they came up with 27, but we asked them to narrow it down to 5. So from the 27, they narrowed down to 5. That includes prevention of forest and peat fire, sustainable commodities, social forestry and agrarian reform, conservation restoration, and clean energy. These are the 5 topics that they've selected as a group. But of course, when we go back to the ground and ask them to define what are the activities they want to do out of that 5 and show us in their midterm development plan and the budget allocation, they cannot come up with 5. So we say again, okay, let's narrow it down again. And the topic for 2018 to 2021 or 2022, which is when their term would end normally, we ended up only focusing on 2 maximum. 1 is commodities. Number 2 is actually the social forestry and agrarian reform. So unfortunately, topics like conservation and restoration, as well as energy, become somewhere hidden in the programmatic decision making. These are the core elements that they themselves sort of prescribe. So we ask them, okay, Pa, if you want to do sustainable commodities, what is it that you actually want to do? And how do you think people would trust you more in terms of designing your program? And this is what they come up with. Number 1 is how to make sure that my constituent feels the impact. Their voters feels that impact. So it needs to reach to the village level. Number 2, is there incentives to get them to actually do the effort? Number 3, do they have the data and can they monitor it? Number 4, is there any policy and regulation in place and can they enforce it? And number 5 is, do they have the capacity to actually do it? So if they want to say that they want to focus on one particular topic, they have to answer at least these 5 questions. That's what they say. I don't want to go down to the details on this, but this is just how we actually cluster our main stakeholders. Sorry, all of the fonts are messy. But the way that we're trying to define success, and here we point back to a research that was done by Diameter Consulting in 2015, that there is very little incentives for politically elected leaders to push for sustainability. So this is how we cluster the incentives. So not only from the national policy side, but also from the development partners, market, investment, and most importantly, the thing that they keep repeating over and over is it doesn't matter if the vision is brown, blue, green, red, whatever, but if the constituent, the voters that would get them re-elected do not feel the impact, it doesn't matter. So these are the summarized skeleton. Again, not going to the details, but I will ask for C4's opinion, and ICRAF, actually, ICRAF and C4 have submitted their opinion through the exercise. But out of the 567 indicators, we tried to summarize it into 5 main principles and 23 basic criteria. But out of this, at least half we don't have data for. That's why, as a secretariat, we are only 3. There's only 3 of us, so we need to work with a network of partners. And this is how the connecting the dots actually happen. Because in terms of implementing, in terms of getting the data on the ground, we would need to actually reach out to the partners. And let me tell you, coordinating partners is not simple because everybody has different interests, different theory of change, KPI, and deliverables. And not everyone wants to share the flag of the projects. And not every district realize how much investment these projects are already giving to the jurisdiction. So just to give you an example, these are a database of around 1,700 smallholders that was made in South Sumatra in a sub-district called in a district called Musi Banyu Asin, sub-district called Lalan. But these are a genuine blended finance effort where government budget was used, corporate budget was used, CSO budget was used, and community, the village heads, was employed as part of the enumerator. And this was done in around 3 months. And using the same data set, so I'm going to pull up another one, we tried to also integrate different databases that are used and acceptable from the corporate perspective. So at the end, they can monitor the same thing and use the same data set. This can be done, but this is 1,700 out of 5 million smallholders. So there's still a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita. That was very interesting. You don't need to call it REDD Plus to get to reduced emissions, I guess. The last speaker now is Nathan Makurege. He's a coordinator currently of the Civil Society Coalition on Indigenous Peoples in Uganda. He's also an Anglophone Africa IP observer, so Indigenous People Observer to FCPF Participants Committee, and an IP's observer to the Carbon Fund. He's a Ugandan, as you gathered by now, human environmental activist engaged in promoting, defending, and protecting the rights of indigenous people in Uganda. He has successfully managed projects aimed at capacity building of indigenous people to participate actively in REDD Plus in Uganda. So I'd like to ask Nathan to come up here, please, and speak. Thanks.
My presentation is going to be short because I was invited on a short notice. As you have been informed, I work with communities in Uganda, particularly with the forest indigenous peoples. And maybe it is important to tell you that when we talk about indigenous peoples in Uganda, the government took everybody to be indigenous, but we have those ones that we classify as minority indigenous people or forest indigenous peoples, and those are the Batwa, the Ik, the Benet, and the Karamajong. But the challenge of naming indigenous peoples is not only in Uganda, but also in other countries of Africa. So my presentation is going to be based on the lessons learned while implementing REDD Plus projects. One thing I can tell you is that the government of Uganda started its REDD Plus program in 2008 when its readiness project idea note was accepted by the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank. And as a result, the government got support from Norway, from Belgium, from Austrian government, from UN, and of course the World Bank. So this one, the REDD Plus became an opportunity, was looked at as an opportunity for indigenous peoples to participate in decision making, to talk about their land, tenure rights, and to benefit in government programs. But this one, of course, had challenges because, first of all, the indigenous peoples live in extreme areas near the forests and which are backward in terms of social services provision, and also these forests have been taken over by the government, and the indigenous peoples moved from those forests by force. So what did it mean? It means that most of the indigenous communities in Uganda are landless, they are poor, and they don't have the knowledge and the capacity. Yet this REDD Plus program is a program that must be well understood if one is to participate effectively, because it's a program that needs one to know what is involved. So I will just maybe highlight on a few issues a few problems before I go to lessons learned. One of the biggest challenge is limited knowledge to know what is within REDD, what are benefits within the REDD program. Because the government of Uganda has the will, has the commitment, but putting the actions in practice is a challenge. They make very good laws, but they don't actually put them on paper. I mean in action. So whatever is there is not known by the indigenous communities, but every day something rolls out, and in rolling it out, you find that indigenous peoples are not involved. there is a very big problem of respecting territories of the indigenous peoples, especially when it comes to investors. As we have been hearing in Africa, we have been trying to bring out investors, and most of the investments, of course, are based on land resources. And which resources and territories are these investors looking at? They are looking at mainly those resources that the government call idle resources, because the government actually does not know, or they intentionally know, but they want just to give out the resources to the investors. We have heard about the Chinese. I don't think that the Chinese are supporting REDD+ program. You have heard about people who are profit-driven in mining, in deforestation. We have people doing investment, but issues of indigenous people are not really protected. The challenge of protecting indigenous people's rights is really based on lack of knowledge and maybe lack of resources. This is why the indigenous peoples, particularly in Africa, don't come out straightforward to defend, to promote their rights as regards to resources. The other challenge, of course, has been marginalization of women and youth. These ones, they are majority, but unfortunately, they are marginalized. Marginalized at society level, whereby women and youth are not really given what they deserve in the community, both by the government, but also by even the indigenous peoples themselves. This is actually still a long way to go to bring these people together. There are, of course, many other challenges, but let me quickly go to lessons learned. We have seen that in the implementation of the REDD+ processes, indigenous peoples want to participate. They want to participate actively, and they want to see the program of REDD successful. But there is still a challenge of understanding the laws, understanding their roles in implementing REDD+ processes, in understanding various programs that can help them, and also reviewing the laws and the policies, and also to participate very well in the policy development, and also knowing the national and subnational actors that are very useful when participating in national REDD processes. Also, there is a need to know that the indigenous peoples are very critical if REDD program is to succeed in Africa. Why? Because most of the indigenous people in Africa are the owners of the forests. So the moment you leave them behind, that means that you are going to leave out something, their knowledge, which knowledge is very critical. And yet, for us to succeed in a REDD process implementation, we need this knowledge. So something I've learned is that there is a need to document, to utilize indigenous people's knowledge. And people who are doing this work, they are doing it hurriedly. They are not doing it in a framework in which involves indigenous peoples. They come out and they start challenging indigenous people's knowledge, not knowing that actually if this knowledge is well utilized, it is very critical in promoting REDD+ effectively. Also, there is a need to focus on women and youth, particularly women. Women are very poor, yet most of the work in Africa is done by women, especially domestic work, preparing food, looking after children, looking for firewood, what we call biomass energy. Remember, in Africa, in Uganda, 90% of the population depend on biomass energy. And the key person, the key actor here is a woman. So unless the world puts focus on improving the lives of women, improving youth, I think we still have a very big challenge. And maybe lastly, I want to say this without too shy. And this is why maybe I like sustainable development goals. The goal number 1 is eradication of poverty. So unless something is done to address the issue of poverty and also livelihoods, I think the issue of achieving a REDD Plus program might be a dream. We need to look at sustainable ways of managing poverty, addressing poverty. I have got an opportunity of moving to other countries, and I have seen that some countries can easily adapt. But you will not tell people not maybe to cut trees, to restore lands, while actually they depend on forests, on land for survival. Unless we look at bridging the gap between the very rich, both at a local level, national level, and international level, I think the achievements of REDD Plus program will not be realized. Of course, I have been attending the World Bank meetings, a few of them. I'm glad that maybe the World Bank is trying to bring out that to address the issue of poverty, and knowing that then what currently Kemper called the natural capital comes out to be protected. So the issue of poverty, I will say it without too shy, that Africa needs to be supported a lot in addressing poverty, and above all, in ensuring that it is sustainable addressing of poverty, not like the way I see some investors coming to Africa, draining resources. They don't want to talk about human rights. They don't want to talk about protecting natural resources, but they're interested in building infrastructure, and they talk about trade, which trade actually does not benefit both the country and the indigenous peoples. So with that, I think let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. We have not made much progress on the front of time. We have just 5 minutes left. Started a bit later. So I just give the opportunity for a few questions that you might have. Please raise your hands and we'll get a microphone to you. There, somebody. Please ask about all the contributions, of course.
Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
It's a question for Mr. Arlith Angelsen. I would like to know what's the responsibility or what's the role for countries Annex 1 or developing countries or other international organizations like World Bank, UN programs, and etc. for that REDD Plus is not in the implementation phase. Like, what's the role in them for this issue?
Please say also your name and where
Norma
from?
Pedrosa from Mexico.
Okay. You want to correct a few? Okay. Another? More questions? Please, here.
I have a question for gentleman from Uganda.
Can you also say your name?
Yeah, it's Jenny Henman from Plant Your Future. So I really enjoyed your presentation, but I just had a question, maybe this is for the whole panel as well. I feel like some of the points you were raising are more wider governance issues within Uganda, the issues of representation of women, indigenous people, youth, like giving them a voice and so on. So my question is, like, can REDD really solve those much wider societal problems, or are we expecting too much from REDD? Because it seems like those are definitely super important points for REDD, but they're actually much wider issues in Uganda. So I don't know if REDD can solve like the women representation issue. Obviously, I would love it to, but that's my question.
Thank you. Do we have a third question? No? Yes, please. One. Huh?
My question to Professor Angelsen. You said that you are a fan of REDD as objective, but not as a framework, a UNFCCC framework. Maybe could you clarify a bit?
So the question is, Aaron said he's a fan about REDD Plus as an objective, not as a framework, and whether he can clarify this. Okay, I think that's what we can do. Who wants to answer?
Thank you very much. Yes, true. Expecting REDD program to be the one to address poverty in Uganda or in Africa would be asking much. But as it is still, as it is, the issue of addressing poverty should be made core in the program of REDD. Two, the issue of representation, particularly women, must really be made a core issue. Because this is a lesson learned. I have seen most of the REDD activities in Uganda and even in other countries. Women do not participate to the required level. And where women have participated very well, there is significant progress. I've been in Rwanda, for instance, although it's not a REDD program, women participate massively in the government processes. And if you go to Rwanda now, you will find that there is a significant progress compared to those countries that have ignored putting women ahead, in front. So I think really you are right. A REDD program is not really the only program that can change Africa, can eradicate poverty. But at least I'm using this forum, and more specifically, involvement of indigenous peoples and indigenous women in the government processes and in REDD in particular.
So just to add to that, I would argue that if climate change strategies don't fully take on the question of inequality and poverty, we're going to keep getting citizens electing climate deniers as presidents in North and South.
Even in more countries. So maybe starting with the last question, on the REDD objective that I'm a fan of. I guess I didn't mean to say that I'm not a fan of kind of REDD of the framework. I think if you say the initial framework was one emphasizing results-based payment, I still think it's a good idea, and I think it's an idea very hard to implement fully. I think also it's, as was mentioned by the two last speakers here, that if we don't address the poverty, the livelihoods, the economic development agenda, it's going to fail. So yes, we maybe should reserve that for the payment for results-based should be in terms of carbon, but you need to deliver on more fronts. So that's one of the lessons I learned, and that we should be careful to kind of fall in love with one particular way of implementing, because it kind of confuses our mind when we are to assess how it works or not. In the first question from a lady from Mexico on the role of donors, FCPF, and various international institutions. I think we say in the book there that international finance nudges, but that the domestic economic incentives are really the ones that decides the outcomes. So in a way, I see a role, but they are not in the driver's seat. It is national governments that have been put in the driver's seat, or maybe subnationals for jurisdictional approaches. So it has a role. I mean, one point I think should also emphasize that I would have liked to see more research, a critical research on the role of donors. And I ask myself, why is that happening? Maybe because they're funding a lot of it and don't want critical research on themselves. That's, of course, a good hypothesis, hard to test, but it's an hypothesis. But there's a lot of scrutiny on REDD country governments, on their work and that. And it would be interesting if Uganda and Indonesia could send researchers to Norway and Germany to undertake research on the role of donors and the mixed objectives they have behind that. So that should be a new research project.
Maybe you give it to Gita. So maybe Gita can give the last closing remark
yeah.
in response to this.
I guess my immediate response to that is that a lot of the research and the know-how and the knowledge in this book, we really hope to find a way to for it to actually reach the decision makers on the ground. Because in a sense, one research, well, I don't want to call it a research because it's not comprehensive as C4, it's just an exercise that we do, is just to look at how this Bupati, the district heads, and the head of agencies, what are they reading every day? Which information channel do they trust most? And then we sort of try to tailor our communication product around it, including to communicate a lot of the research product. We're not there yet, but hopefully once we get the formula right, it might as well be a WhatsApp message, honestly, because that's how information flow these days. I might have you translate some of the chapters to WhatsApp group messages. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks for being the first books reader, and I hope it didn't put you asleep on the plane. Yeah, at least you didn't come here and, give us some negative feedback. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for being here. I'd like to say one thing. The next session is the book launch, which is going to happen in something called Landscapes Action Pavilion, downstairs, the rolling escalator just in front of the escalator. So there will be another half hour of interviews of some of the book editors, not me. And I'd like to ask you to give a show of hands to the panelists. Thanks very much for being here, and thank you all for talking. Thanks.